Unaware his pregnant wife's father owns the court, a husband stands beside his mistress and actually laughs, as she kicks his pregnant wife's stomach so hard the woman collapses, clutching her belly, begging her unborn baby to stay alive. The mistress, in her tight red dress and diamond earrings, kicks again, harder, screaming that the pregnant wife deserves it. The husband, this man who once promised forever, pulls out his phone and films his pregnant wife bleeding on the marble floor, her hands desperately pressed against her swollen stomach where their baby has stopped moving. But what the mistress doesn't know, what the husband can't see through his arrogance, is that the judge sitting 10 feet away, watching his pregnant wife crawl toward the witness stand leaving a trail of blood, is her father, the man who owns this court, every lawyer in it, and every piece of evidence they tried to hide. The pregnant wife's father, jaw clenched, gavel trembling in his hand, hasn't seen his daughter since she was 6 years old. But now, watching his pregnant daughter's life drain onto his courtroom floor while her husband laughs, something ancient and unstoppable awakens in him. What happens next leaves the mistress screaming for forgiveness she'll never receive, and the husband begging for mercy from the one man in the world who has none left to give. But how did a pregnant wife's father who lost his daughter 2 decades ago end up in the exact courtroom where his own child is being murdered? And what secret about the pregnant wife's baby makes this father's revenge even more devastating than anyone imagined? 3 hours earlier, the morning had started with a different kind of violence. Sophia Chen, 7 months pregnant and exhausted, had stood in the kitchen of the mansion she once believed was her home, watching her husband Marcus pack a suitcase. Not for a business trip, for her. He told her she had until noon to leave. His mistress Vanessa was moving in today. Sophia's hands shook as she gripped the counter. She asked him about their baby, about the daughter growing inside her that he'd promised to love. Marcus didn't even look up from his phone. He said Vanessa was pregnant too, and that baby mattered more. He said Sophia had become boring, weak, and useless. He said his lawyers already drafted the divorce papers and she'd be lucky to get supervised visitation once a month. Sophia felt her knees weaken, but she didn't cry. Not yet. She'd already cried every night for 3 months since discovering the affair. She'd cried when Marcus started coming home smelling like Vanessa's perfume. She'd cried when he stopped touching her belly to feel their daughter kick. She'd cried when he made her sleep in the guest room because her pregnancy body disgusted him. But that morning, standing in the kitchen where she'd once baked him birthday cakes and kissed him on Christmas mornings, Sophia decided she wouldn't leave quietly. She told Marcus she was filing for custody, for child support, for half of everything he built during their marriage. That's when his face changed. The mask of indifference cracked, and underneath was something cold and reptilian. He stepped close to her, so close she could smell coffee on his breath. And he whispered that if she tried to fight him in court, he'd make sure she never saw their daughter again. He said he had money, power, and lawyers who could prove she was mentally unstable. He said he'd already paid a doctor to testify that Sophia suffered from prenatal psychosis. Then he smiled, that same smile she'd fallen in love with 6 years ago, and told her the hearing was in 2 hours. He'd already filed emergency motions. He'd already frozen their joint accounts. He'd already moved all her belongings to a storage unit across town. Sophia's chest tightened as the room spun around her. She pressed her hand to her belly and felt her daughter kick weakly, as if sensing her mother's panic. Marcus left the kitchen, and seconds later, Vanessa walked in wearing one of Sophia's silk robes. She poured herself coffee from Sophia's favorite mug and sat at the table like she owned the place, because apparently she did now. Vanessa looked at Sophia with eyes that held no guilt, no shame, only triumph. She told Sophia that Marcus never loved her, that he only married her because his investors liked the image of a stable family man. She said Marcus had been planning to leave Sophia since the day the pregnancy test came back positive. Then Vanessa said something that made Sophia's blood turn to ice. She said that once Sophia's baby was born, Marcus would take full custody and Vanessa would raise the child as her own. Sophia's daughter would call Vanessa mom and forget Sophia ever existed. Sophia stared at this woman, this stranger who destroyed her life, and for the first time in months, she felt something stronger than sadness. She felt rage. Pure, burning, unshakable rage. She told Vanessa that she'd see her in court. Vanessa laughed, the same laugh Marcus had laughed, and said that Sophia had no idea who she was dealing with. Then she leaned forward and whispered that she'd make sure Sophia's baby came early, one way or another. The threat hung in the air like poison. Sophia turned and walked out of the house, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grip her car keys. She had no money, no lawyer, and no plan. But she had one thing Marcus didn't know about: a name, a memory. A silver-haired man she hadn't seen since she was 6 years old but whose face she'd never forgotten. Her father, Judge William Chen, the most powerful family court judge in the state. The man her mother had taken her away from in a custody battle so vicious it had made headlines 23 years ago. Sophia's mother had told her that her father didn't want her, that he'd chosen his career over his family. But Sophia had kept one photograph hidden in a box under her childhood bed. A photo of her father holding her on his shoulders at a park, both of them laughing, his eyes filled with a love so fierce it burned through the picture. She'd always wondered if her mother had lied. Now, driving toward the courthouse with her baby kicking anxiously inside her, Sophia was about to find out. The courtroom smelled like old wood and fear. Sophia sat alone at the petitioner's table, her hands folded protectively over her belly, trying to keep her breathing steady. Across the aisle, Marcus sat between his lawyer and Vanessa, all three of them whispering and smiling like they were at a country club instead of a custody hearing. Sophia's public defender, a tired woman with coffee stains on her blazer, had already told her the truth. With Marcus's money and legal team, Sophia would be lucky to get supervised visits twice a month. The bailiff called the court to order and Sophia's heart nearly stopped. Because walking through the judge's chamber door, black robes flowing behind him, silver hair catching the fluorescent lights, was the man from the photograph. Her father, Judge William Chen. He moved to the bench with the controlled precision of someone who'd commanded courtrooms for 30 years. His face showed nothing, no recognition, no emotion, just professional distance. But when his eyes swept the room and landed on Sophia, something flickered. His hand gripped the gavel tighter. His jaw tensed. Sophia felt tears burn behind her eyes. Did he recognize her? Could he possibly remember the little girl who used to fall asleep on his chest while he read case files? Or had 23 years erased her completely? Marcus's lawyer stood first, his voice smooth and practiced. He painted Sophia as unstable, depressed, incapable of caring for a child. He presented doctored medical records suggesting she'd missed prenatal appointments and psychiatric evaluations recommending she wasn't fit for motherhood. Every word was a knife. Every lie cut deeper. Sophia tried to speak, tried to defend herself, but her public defender kept whispering that outbursts would only make things worse. Then Marcus took the stand. He described Sophia as paranoid and controlling, claiming she'd threatened to hurt herself and the baby if he left her. He said he feared for his unborn daughter's safety. He looked directly at the judge when he said it, his voice trembling with fake emotion. The performance was flawless. Sophia watched the man she'd loved transform into a monster wearing her husband's face. Vanessa sat in the gallery behind him, nodding sympathetically, playing the concerned future stepmother. Judge Chen listened without expression, taking notes, his pen moving steadily across the paper. When Marcus finished, the judge's eyes moved to Sophia. He asked if she wished to testify. Sophia stood slowly, her legs shaking, her baby pressing heavily against her ribs. She approached the witness stand and placed her hand on the Bible. As she swore to tell the truth, she looked directly at her father and said something only he would understand. She said her full name, Sophia Marie Chen, and added that her father always called her his little lion because she was born brave. Judge Chen's pen stopped moving. His eyes locked onto hers. His face drained of color. And in that moment, 23 years of separation shattered like glass. But before anyone could speak, before the moment could settle, Vanessa stood up from her seat, her face twisted with rage, and screamed that Sophia was a liar who didn't deserve to breathe the same air as Marcus. The judge's gavel came down hard, his voice commanding order. Vanessa ignored him. She pushed past the railing, her red dress bright as blood under the courtroom lights, her diamond earrings catching the light as she moved toward Sophia with pure hatred in her eyes. Marcus didn't stop her. He leaned back in his chair, pulled out his phone, and smiled. Security moved too slowly, and that's when Vanessa's foot connected with Sophia's stomach. Sophia collapsed instantly. The air punched from her lungs. Her world reduced to the single unbearable sensation of impact rippling through her abdomen. She hit the marble floor hard, her hands flying to her stomach, fingers spread wide as if she could physically hold her baby inside. A scream tore from her throat, raw and animal, the sound a mother makes when her child is in danger. Blood pooled beneath her, warm and terrifying, spreading across the white marble in a pattern that would haunt everyone watching. The metallic smell filled the air. Sophia's vision blurred as pain exploded through her body, radiating from her belly outward like shockwaves. She tried to curl into herself, tried to protect the life inside her, but her muscles wouldn't respond. All she could do was press her palms against her stomach and beg, "Please, please, please stay with me, baby. Please don't leave Mommy." Vanessa stood over her, chest heaving, eyes blazing with a satisfaction so twisted it looked like joy. Her red dress seemed brighter against the white floor, her diamond earrings catching the courtroom lights as she stood there admiring her work. Then she lifted her foot again. The room seemed to move in slow motion as her designer heel aimed directly at Sophia's ribs, at the curve where her pregnant belly was most vulnerable. Someone in the gallery screamed, but Vanessa didn't stop. Her foot came down again, harder this time, connecting with Sophia's side with a sickening thud that made several people in the courtroom gasp and look away. Sophia's body jerked from the impact. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything except feel her baby's movements inside her growing weaker, slower, more desperate. And Marcus laughed. Actually laughed. The sound cut through the chaos like a blade, cold and delighted, and utterly inhuman. He stood just a few feet away, his expensive suit perfectly pressed, his phone held up high, recording everything. His thumb was steady on the screen, capturing every second of his wife bleeding on the floor, every moment of her agony. He leaned toward his lawyer and said something that made the man's face go pale. Something about how this footage was perfect, how it proved Sophia was unstable and caused scenes, how this would guarantee he'd get full custody and she'd be lucky to ever see their daughter again. He zoomed in on Sophia's face, on her tears, on the blood spreading beneath her. He was creating evidence. He was documenting what he believed was his victory. Several people in the gallery stood up horrified, trying to move towards Sophia to help her. But Marcus's security detail, two large men he'd hired specifically for this hearing, blocked them. One woman, elderly with gray hair, shoved past them anyway and dropped to her knees beside Sophia, pressing her scarf against the blood, whispering that help was coming, that she needed to stay awake. Sophia's eyes rolled back. Her lips moved but no sound came out. Her hand, still pressed to her belly, trembled violently. Inside her, the baby had stopped kicking. Judge William Chen rose from the bench like a mountain coming to life, like something ancient and unstoppable, waking from a long sleep. For 30 years, he'd maintained perfect judicial composure. For 3 decades, he'd been the model of restraint, fairness, and measured response. But watching his daughter, the child stolen from him 23 years ago, the little girl he'd searched for through endless sleepless nights, lying in a pool of her own blood while the father of her child laughed, something inside him didn't just break. It detonated. His gavel came down with such force that the sound cracked through the air like thunder, like the earth itself splitting open. The wood actually splintered under the impact. The entire courtroom fell silent instantly, even Vanessa, even Marcus. Every head turned toward the bench. Judge Chen's voice, when it came, wasn't the measured tone of a judge anymore. It was the roar of a father who'd found his child only to watch her being murdered in front of him. It carried 30 years of grief, 23 years of searching, and a rage so pure it made the air itself feel heavy. He pointed directly at Vanessa with a shaking finger and said one word that made her stumble backward. "Arrest her." Now, his voice echoed off the high courtroom ceilings. Then he turned that same finger toward Marcus, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Arrest him too. Accessory to assault. Filming a violent crime without intervention. Reckless endangerment of an unborn child. The bailiffs moved immediately, but Judge Chen wasn't finished. He kept talking, his words coming faster, sharper, each one a hammer blow. He said he'd watched the entire assault. He said he'd seen Vanessa kick a defenseless pregnant woman not once but twice while she lay helpless on the ground. He said he'd seen Marcus not only fail to protect his wife but actively document her suffering for his own legal advantage. He said that in 30 years on the bench he'd seen murderers, abusers, and monsters of every kind, but he'd never seen anything as depraved as what just happened in his courtroom. Vanessa's face went from satisfied to confused to terrified in the span of seconds. She started to speak, started to say she was defending herself, that Sophia had provoked her, that this was all a misunderstanding. But Judge Chen cut her off with a look so fierce she actually took a step back. He told her that every word out of her mouth was being recorded. He told her that she'd just committed aggravated assault in front of 40 witnesses, 3 cameras, and a judge. He told her she was looking at 8 to 15 years in prison. Then he pointed at Marcus and said something that made the man's confident smirk finally collapse. He said that by filming instead of helping, Marcus had legally become an accessory to assault. He said that by failing to protect his wife, Marcus had violated his legal duty as a spouse. He said that by planning to use this footage in custody proceedings, Marcus had demonstrated consciousness of guilt and intent to benefit from a crime. The legal terms flew fast and precise, each one a nail in Marcus's coffin. Marcus's lawyer tried to object, tried to say something about judicial bias, about the need for a different judge. But Judge Chen simply looked at him, and the lawyer's voice died in his throat. The judge said that any attorney who would defend a man who laughed while his pregnant wife was assaulted should seriously reconsider their bar membership. Then Judge Chen did something that no judge should ever do, something that violated every rule of judicial conduct, something that would be talked about in legal circles for decades. He came down from the bench. He moved past the bailiff who reached out to stop him. He moved past the lawyers frozen in shock. He moved past the reporters with their cameras and the gallery full of people, and he knelt on the blood-soaked marble floor beside his daughter. His black robes pooled around him, soaking up blood, and he didn't care. He pulled the robe off his shoulders and pressed it against Sophia's stomach, applying pressure with hands that had signed 1,000 orders but had never felt this helpless. Blood soaked through the fabric immediately, warm and terrible. He whispered her name, Sophia, my little lion, and his voice cracked on every syllable. He told her to hold on. He told her the ambulance was coming. He told her she was strong, so strong, the bravest person he'd ever known. Tears ran down his face, cutting through 30 years of judicial composure, washing away 3 decades of professionalism. Sophia's eyes fluttered open. Through the haze of pain and fear, she saw him. Really saw him. The silver hair, the strong jaw. The eyes filled with a love so fierce it burned through everything else. She whispered, her voice barely audible, that she'd looked for him. She said her mother told her he didn't want her, that he'd chosen his career over his daughter, that he was glad when they left. She said she never believed it. She said she kept his picture hidden under her bed for 23 years. She said she used to talk to it at night, telling him about her day, imagining what he might say back. Judge Chen's face broke completely. His shoulders shook. He gripped her hand so tightly it should have hurt, but Sophia felt only comfort. He told her he'd spent 23 years searching. He said her mother had taken her across state lines during what was supposed to be a weekend visit and never came back. He said she'd changed both their names, moved 6 times in 8 years, made sure he could never find them. He said he'd hired private investigators. He said he'd spent every birthday, every Christmas, every Father's Day wondering if she was safe, if she was happy, if she even remembered him. He said he'd kept her bedroom exactly the way it was the day she left, still had her stuffed animals, her books, her little shoes by the door. He said there wasn't a single day in 23 years when he didn't think about her. He said he never stopped being her father. Paramedics burst through the courtroom doors, their equipment clattering, their movements fast and professional. They dropped beside Sophia, assessing her vitals, checking her pupils, placing an oxygen mask over her face. One of them gently moved Judge Chen aside, but he refused to let go of Sophia's hand. He stayed right there, kneeling in blood, holding his daughter while they worked. They called out numbers that meant nothing to most people, but everything to medical professionals. Blood pressure dropping. Fetal heart rate inconsistent. Possible placental abruption. They lifted Sophia onto a stretcher, moving with urgent efficiency, and Judge Chen stood with them, still holding her hand, his other hand on the stretcher rail. As they began wheeling her toward the courtroom doors, Sophia's grip tightened on his hand. She looked at him through the oxygen mask, her eyes desperate, and whispered something that made the paramedics pause. She said if she didn't make it, if something happened, she needed him to promise to take care of her baby. She needed him to promise her daughter would know she was wanted, that she was loved, that her mother fought for her until the very end. Judge Chen leaned down close, his forehead nearly touching hers, and he promised. He said Sophia wasn't going anywhere. He said she was going to hold her baby and raise her baby and watch her baby grow. He said he just found his daughter and he wasn't losing her again. The stretcher moved through the doors and toward the waiting ambulance, Judge Chen walking beside it the entire way, still in his blood-stained white shirt, his hand never leaving Sophia's. The courtroom behind them had erupted into chaos. Reporters shouted questions. Gallery members stood in stunned silence. Bailiffs surrounded Marcus and Vanessa, who were both talking frantically, their earlier confidence completely shattered. But Judge Chen didn't look back. Not once. His daughter needed him. Everything else could wait. At the hospital, Sophia was rushed into emergency surgery. The baby was in distress. Sophia was hemorrhaging. The doctors told Judge Chen that they might have to choose, that if complications arose, they'd need his consent on who to prioritize. Judge Chen, standing in the sterile hallway in his ruined shirt, looked at the doctor and said to save them both. The doctor started to explain that might not be possible, but Judge Chen interrupted. He said he'd just gotten his daughter back and he was about to meet his granddaughter. He said failure wasn't an option. He said they'd do whatever it took. Then he sat down in the waiting room chair, put his face in his hands, and for the first time since Sophia was taken from him 23 years ago, Judge William Chen prayed. 3 hours passed like 3 years. Nurses walked by with sympathetic looks. Other families came and went. Judge Chen didn't move. He sat in that chair, blood dried on his hands, and waited. Finally, a doctor emerged, still in surgical gear, pulling down her mask. Judge Chen stood so fast the chair scraped loudly against the floor. The doctor smiled. A small, tired, beautiful smile. She said Sophia was stable. She said the baby was born premature at 30 weeks, but breathing on her own. She said they were both going to be okay. Judge Chen's knees nearly buckled. He gripped the back of the chair to steady himself and asked if he could see them. The doctor led him down a long hallway to a recovery room. Inside, Sophia lay in the hospital bed, pale and exhausted, hooked up to monitors and IVs, but alive. And in her arms, wrapped in a pink blanket, was the tiniest, most perfect baby Judge Chen had ever seen. Sophia looked up when he entered. Tears immediately filled her eyes. She shifted the baby slightly and whispered if he wanted to hold his granddaughter. Judge Chen approached slowly, almost reverently, as if the moment might shatter if he moved too fast. He'd held hundreds of babies over the years, friends' children, nieces, nephews. But when Sophia carefully transferred that tiny bundle into his arms, when he looked down at the small face with closed eyes and perfect little fingers, something happened that he'd thought was impossible. His heart, broken 23 years ago, began to heal. He sat in the chair beside Sophia's bed, cradling his granddaughter, and wept. Not sad tears, not grief. Pure, overwhelming joy mixed with relief so profound it felt like being born again himself. Sophia reached over and took his free hand. They sat like that for a long time, father and daughter reunited. A new generation between them. The three of them forming a family that had been torn apart and violently, miraculously stitched back together. Sophia whispered that she'd named the baby Grace, because Grace was what saved them. Grace was what brought her father into that courtroom. Grace was what kept her baby alive through everything. Judge Chen repeated the name, testing it, loving it. Grace Chen, his granddaughter. 2 weeks later, Marcus and Vanessa were brought back into the same courtroom, But everything had changed. They weren't sitting confidently at the defendant's table anymore. They were standing in orange jumpsuits, hands cuffed behind their backs, flanked by guards. The courtroom was packed, even more crowded than before. News of what happened had spread nationally. People lined up at dawn for a chance to witness what came next. Judge Chen returned to the bench, composed and professional once more, though everyone who'd been there that day could see something different in his eyes. A hardness that hadn't existed before. A father's protective fury wrapped in judicial authority. Marcus's new lawyer, his fourth one because the first three had quit, tried to argue for leniency. He said Marcus had made a mistake in judgment. He said Marcus was a good man who'd panicked. He said Marcus deeply regretted his actions. Judge Chen let him finish. Then he asked Marcus directly if he had anything to say. Marcus stood, and for the first time since this whole nightmare began, he looked small, diminished, afraid. He started to speak, his voice shaking, saying he was sorry, that he didn't know what came over him, that he wanted to make things right. Judge Chen stopped him. He said that Marcus had stood beside his mistress and laughed while she kicked his pregnant wife. He said Marcus had filmed his wife's suffering to use against her in court. He said Marcus had shown not one single second of remorse until he realized he'd be held accountable. He said Marcus didn't regret his actions. He regretted the consequences. Then Judge Chen sentenced him. 5 years in prison for accessory to aggravated assault. Permanent termination of all parental rights to baby Grace. A restraining order preventing him from ever contacting Sophia or Grace again. Full forfeiture of all marital assets to Sophia as restitution. The courtroom erupted in applause before the bailiff called for order. Marcus's face went gray. He tried to speak, tried to beg, but the guards were already leading him away. Vanessa was next. She'd been sitting with her head down, crying, her makeup smeared, looking nothing like the confident woman in the red dress. Her lawyer argued that Vanessa had acted in a moment of passion, that she hadn't intended serious harm, that she deserved a second chance. Judge Chen looked at Vanessa and asked her if she had anything to say for herself. Vanessa stood, her chains rattling, and she did something that shocked everyone. She got on her knees. Right there in the courtroom, she knelt on the floor and begged. She said she was sorry. She said she didn't know Sophia was really hurt. She said she'd been manipulated by Marcus. She said she'd made a terrible mistake, and she'd spend the rest of her life trying to make up for it. She begged for forgiveness. She begged for mercy. She begged Judge Chen to see that she was a good person who'd done a bad thing. The courtroom fell silent, waiting. Judge Chen looked at this woman who'd kicked his pregnant daughter, who'd tried to kill his granddaughter, who'd shown no remorse until facing consequences. He thought about Sophia in the hospital bed. He thought about baby Grace in the NICU, so small and fragile. He thought about 23 years without his daughter because of someone else's cruelty. Then he spoke. He said that mercy was for people who showed remorse before they were caught. He said forgiveness was for people who took responsibility without being forced. He said that Vanessa had kicked a pregnant woman not once but twice. He said she'd done it in front of witnesses, with full awareness of what she was doing. He said she'd smiled afterward. Then he sentenced her. 8 years in prison for aggravated assault. Additional charges for assault on an unborn child. A permanent restraining order. And a civil judgment of $2 million in damages to be paid to Sophia. Vanessa screamed. She actually screamed that it wasn't fair, that the judge was biased, that she had rights. Judge Chen simply looked at her and said she'd had the right to walk away. She'd had the right to do nothing. She'd chosen violence instead. Guards lifted Vanessa from the floor and dragged her toward the door, her screams echoing off the courtroom walls. Marcus, waiting in the hallway, heard her coming. Through the window in the door, people could see the moment they saw each other. The moment they realized they'd destroyed each other chasing something that was never real. In the gallery, Sophia sat holding baby Grace, now 3 weeks old and growing stronger every day. Her father's arm was around her shoulders. She watched Marcus and Vanessa being led away and felt something she hadn't expected. Not satisfaction, not joy. Just a quiet, steady sense that the world had corrected itself. That justice, real justice, had happened. Baby Grace made a small sound, a tiny coo, and Sophia looked down at her daughter. This little girl who'd survived so much already. This miracle wrapped in pink. Sophia whispered that she'd never let anyone hurt her again. Judge Chen heard her and squeezed her shoulder. He said Grace would never know a day without protection, without love, without family. He said that he'd missed 23 years of Sophia's life, but he wouldn't miss a single day of Grace's. After the sentencing, reporters flooded the courthouse steps. They wanted to interview Judge Chen, wanted to know about his daughter, wanted to turn the story into something sensational. But Judge Chen walked past all of them without a word, his arm around Sophia, helping her carry baby Grace to his car. They drove to his house, the house Sophia had lived in until she was 6, the house her father had kept exactly the same. When they walked inside, Sophia stopped in the doorway of her old bedroom. It was exactly as she remembered. Her bed with the purple comforter, her bookshelf with the fairy tale books, her stuffed rabbit on the pillow. Her father had kept it like a shrine for 23 years, waiting for the day she might come home. Sophia turned to him, tears streaming down her face, and hugged him. Really hugged him. The kind of hug that makes up for decades of missing each other. Judge Chen held his daughter and his granddaughter and felt his broken world finally become whole again. That night, Sophia sat in her old room, feeding Grace, looking at the glow-in-the-dark stars still stuck to her ceiling from childhood. Her father knocked softly and came in, carrying 2 cups of tea. They talked until dawn. She told him everything. Every year of her life he'd missed. Every moment she'd needed him. Every time she'd looked at his picture and wondered if he remembered her. He told her that remembering was all he did. That loving her was the only constant in 23 years of searching. And sitting there, in the room where she'd once been a child, now a mother herself, Sophia finally understood what home meant. If you haven't already, turn on the notification bell so you never miss stories of justice, redemption, and the kind of love that survives everything. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from you all over the world.